My hair is really big today. I don't know what's going on. I'm not really cutting it during non-cutting days. The years of yore when we went and got haircuts. So I want to talk about what happens to content after it dies. In Final Fantasy XIV and in World of Warcraft, I'm seeing discussions about like legacy content and about what will happen to current content and how it will age. And there's a life cycle to content that is part of what makes comparing these games faulty. We can't just not compare them. You can't just have two games in the same genre and then just say they're totally different, because that's also not fair. That's also not faulty. The developers themselves not only admit, but actually say that they prefer to have members of the team that play other games. They don't want to design in a vacuum, and they don't design in a vacuum. And when players take breaks, we don't just suddenly say, I really liked this game for a while. It no longer fits what I'm looking for. I don't ever want to play anything about what I liked about it ever again. I would like to move directly from this to the opposite of this. Like, we end up, saying, okay, well, what are the things about this game that I liked? What has that and doesn't have the crap that's making me leave? So there are lots of players that like a lot of things about MMORPGs, and they don't immediately bail to, they don't want to just remove the multiplayer, so they go to single player. They don't just want to lean into gameplay more, so they don't have other game types that are going to totally scratch that itch. They may play something like Halo or Overwatch or Europa or Beat Saber off to the side that is this totally separate thing, or whatever, but they probably, at least after a time, will miss MMORPGs. And a significant number of us, if we leave 14, find ourselves in WoW, or if we leave WoW, we find ourselves in 14. And then you start to hear people say, oh, well, this is why I didn't like that game. Well, it's hard because there's a timeline to content, and we're always talking about things in past tense because that's all we can judge. When we talk too far in the future, you have to be really, really careful. Even with patterns like 2 tomes in a raid in 14, even with catch-up mechanics and stuff like that. What happens when the pattern changes? Both games have shown they can surprise us, good and bad. We call for innovation, but what we really mean when we call for innovation is we call for innovation we like. Should it be innovation that moves the game in a bad direction, we are going to rage. So I think that what we really need to kind of understand when we're comparing Shadowlands versus Shadowbringers is very much that Shadowlands is not a finished thought. No part of it is. There will be changes to the Maw. There will be changes to Torghast. There will be changes to the way Covenants work. We haven't seen all 40 renown levels, so even if they don't add changes, we haven't seen it all. Torghast will go up in floors. I believe, based on the last FanFest, that it is possible that at the end we're going to have like a Mage Tower type component at the end, and it won't be forgiving, and it'll be purely cosmetic, and I look forward to that. I hope it wasn't trimmed. It's also possible, based on what they said during PTR and all of that leading into the expansion, that it sounded like it might have been trimmed. So, who knows? There are things we have yet to know. So when comparing the content as like, what is this like? What is this similar to? We can do that now. We can do that in real time. When we say which one did it better, it gets much harder, because one game has a finished and completed thought. It gets a chance to plug any holes that it may have initially had. It gets a chance to build on itself, round on itself, answer any questions we had, respond. It also has a chance to ruin it. It also has a chance to just drive it into the ground and just show that they weren't listening, and just show that they have no idea how to implement whatever idea started in a design meeting is sounding really good, and by the time it made it to us is just a convoluted mess. It has that chance, and we don't get to know which way it's steering as it gets put into the game until we've played it. Now, content creators consume it way faster. Many of them go consume it on a PTR, and I have never personally had, you know, a time in my life where I could put a ton of time into the PTR because either A, I feel like I'm trying to keep up in the current game, or B, I just don't have a lot of time, period. Now that I'm getting to stream more, maybe the next PTR, maybe I do get to be one of those guys that goes and spends, you know, a third of my time in a week on stuff that doesn't matter and is going to get deleted so that I can put my feedback in. But that group recommending, like, being the test group isn't a perfect representation of the entire community. When you have creators, myself included, we consume content differently than non-creators, and there's a spectrum within both. You have people who are not creators that are at a point in life, maybe they're off school for the summer, maybe they're retired, you know, they get to play a preposterous amount of hours. And you have people who are busy, and this is that escape, 1 or 2 hours a week. You also have content creators that tend to lean towards that second group, but there are content creators that are variety streamers, and they barely touch each game. So on each game level, they are a casual scratch-the-surface player, but their total gaming bandwidth is enormous. So they say, this is everything going on in the space. And some of them do it very well. Some of them actually get surprisingly deep and touch things very briefly and then move on. Skill Up is a great example of somebody that comes in, gets a full and complete snapshot of a game, and then moves to the next game. And occasionally he comes back and visits a game, but most of the time when he does that, he's just doing it for himself. We don't always get a video that shows us how that game's evolved. It's rare and it's enjoyable, but they're not always there because the audience isn't there for that, as opposed to, okay, but this other game just came out. Is it worth it? Like, that's what his channel, that's what feeds that. So I think that, like, saying that Shadowlands content is like Shadowbringers content has a lot of truth to it, but then moving on to say, like, Torghast is better or worse than Deep Dungeon, we can't know that yet. And so the typical life cycle of content in both games is we release a large initial serving, and then over a series of patches, we add to that. And not every piece of content gets something added to it every single patch. And the ones that do, not every single patch is of equal quantity or caliber. There is a variance that happens over the course of an expansion, and it is affected by what else is going on in the patch, right? The total size of the patch in content. It is affected by what's going on in the narrative, what's an appropriate gameplay element for what the story we want to tell. Whether or not people like that story isn't the point. It is part of a content story that they want to tell, right? We want to build a mechanic up, and then we want to use that mechanic. There's a process to that, and as a non-narrative driven player, you know, I'm actively interested in story now, but it's a little late after 15 years of ignoring it. I find that, you know, there's plenty of story just coming from the development of a game. I can see where they started. I can see what they realized based on feedback, based on their own playtime. You know, I really wish that Step 2 felt like this, and you can see where they fall short because you go listen to a panel and you listen to their goals, and then you compare it to what they did, and you say, you hit that, or you say, that wasn't even close to what you said you were going to do. That's what, when I talk about the Shadowlands change to the leveling experience and what they were aiming at and who they were aiming to target and how they were aiming to do it, I think for their set of goals, they knocked it out of the park. Do I think there are people that won't enjoy it? Sure, there were always going to be. You can't create a piece of content that will, you know, satisfy all players of all backgrounds all the time. It won't happen. So the best thing I can do is judge them by my scorecard, right? Because I know it and I'm biased against, I like me. I hope you like you. And the scorecard that they set out for us, which they do in things like BlizzCon. And then it goes through that, and they're 2-year cycles, give or take. And they're alternating. Final Fantasy, World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy, World of Warcraft. And we're moving through that, and we have these big content patches, and we have in-between content patches you know, that where things are constantly trickling out, and there's things that are time gated. That's intentional. So it's meant to be like so that 2 weeks after the patch, you're really just getting into this piece, and that's all part of a fabric that makes up the entire expansion. And that's great. That's most of what we're talking about all the time, is the current piece. But what happens to it after that? What happens to it when we go through the end of an expansion where we cheapen everything for one big victory lap, and then we toss it away? Well, for new players, it's still new content. So there are new players that will touch on it, but they're not going to touch raids. They're not going to touch hard modes of things, anything that adds difficulty. They're not going to touch endgame grind mechanics as they level that unlock things like legendaries, relics, etc. It's not really set up for that. They're typically going to out level it, so typically they're going to hit the level cap for that area before they make it into what would have been endgame, because the experience curve is usually adjusted. They're not really going to do a ton of PvP for that zone, so unless that playlist stays in action, which in both games it kind of does, that's going to kind of feel, it's not going to feel as attached to the expansion. Wintergrass doesn't feel as attached to Wrath of the Lich King now that it's just in a playlist and you're not playing Wrath and saying, oh, Wintergrass is almost up, I should make my way there. They don't have that. The dailies are going to feel hyper optional because there's nothing on that loot table that's not just cosmetic to them. And so, like, your use of an expansion at just a base level, what happens when a new player just touches on it, moves on, is really, really cheapened compared to what it was when it was new, when it was relevant, and when that was the best gameplay they'd ever designed. Assuming each expansion is better than the last, which is not the case. It should always be learning from the past. They should always be doing something the past didn't do. And I think each expansion, in some way, has improved over the previous game. The question is, did they also, is it a one step forward, two steps back type thing? But there's always some technical hurdle that they can now do. There's always a storytelling device or a gameplay device or a class mechanic that they can add to the game that either they'd never thought of or simply wasn't possible prior to that. And so each expansion kind of moves the needle forward a little bit. It just doesn't always feel good. And that the new player doesn't really get to feel that because they're in current time. So it's just dead, right? Well, not exactly. So both games have ways of encouraging current players to keep old content alive, and both games do it poorly. Terribly poorly. So World of Warcraft supports add-ons. The first thing that keeps old content alive, outside of what they consider the leveling, is their system called Time Walking, where they pick weeks of the calendar and they encourage you to run old dungeons and trade for cosmetics at kind of a scaled type difficulty. And they have some types of content have events tied to it. So you have seasonal events that will take you back and interact with certain vendors, certain locations. You have systems like battle pets that'll encourage you to go back and kind of collect things. The achievement pane is a really good reason to go back and kind of finish things out. They have events, especially towards the end of an expansion, where they give out bonus reputation and stuff like that. So if there was ever a project that you finished and you put away during times in the game when they feel you might be bored, they can say, hey, here's something you can do if you want to. Otherwise, please stay subscribed. Like, that's World of Warcraft's solution, and then add-ons augment that. But since 14 doesn't objectively allow add-ons, we'll have to do that as a third section. Final Fantasy XIV has dungeons built into its main story quest. So into its campaign quest that leads you through each expansion, its required set of quests, there are times that you have to do group content. It is required. There is no way past it for a new player. When you're leveling your alternate jobs, because they're all on one character, you don't have to. So everybody has to do it once. So imagine in WoW, once you've done this once, it would say, you have to do group content now. Unless you don't want to, then you can skip it. There's a dialogue box that pops up on alts for mechanics like that, so you don't have to do things that would be fun maybe once, but maybe wouldn't be fun the 35th time. And so that's effectively what's happening in 14. You don't do the story a second time. Unless you really want to, and then they don't have rewards for it. So that's required, which means you need people. You need people to be in that expansion to run that dungeon. They have to be there. Because if they're not, the person just stalls out. So the first thing they do is they tie a portion of current level content, of current level gear, to a currency, kind of like PvP currency. You have a base level currency that's unlocked, your base honor. That's called their Tomestones of Poetics. That's available in an unlimited quantity. It shows up all the time. You can have up to 2,000 of it stored at a time. They then from there move to like an uncapped tome, which is always the previous tome. That buys like a really beginner set of gear. And then they have your top level tome, which you can only get to 450 of it per week. And then pieces will cost in that kind of 300 to just over the weekly cap. Like there's a ballpark there. I think the prices are always fixed. I just don't always do it because I don't chase BIS anymore. When I did chase BIS, like I knew the price of every single item. And I was like, no, this is how much you need. How do you not know that? It's been a while since I've chased BIS. So I don't know that. But basically you chase that, and one of the sources of getting it is running roulettes. Roulettes are random sets of dungeons, and you get a reward at the end, kind of like the satchel you get in WoW, but you need it if you're going to try to stay geared. And one of the roulettes is the leveling roulette, and it puts you into a dungeon of the past. You basically run a time walking dungeon from any expansion. It could be any piece of content, and you hop in and like it'll even tell you in the chat box, one or more players has never completed this. You're going to get some bonus tomes, which is of the bottom tier, and which is just cosmetic mostly, or like for leveling alts, I guess. I don't know. I don't ever use them. They were tied to our relic this time, so they were kind of used like soul ash in a way, but they basically just said, go run one. And you need to do this once per day. Go run an old raid. Go run and you pick from those. And enough people engage in that system that keeps new players moving along. I'm sorry if new players are a DPS, because just like WoW, your queue times are longer than healers and tanks. But it gets you into dungeons at about the same pace that you'd be able to get into current level dungeons if you were at cap. And so that's kind of one of the ways that they keep players of going back. Beyond that, they have some seasonal events, but they're mostly self-contained within capital cities, so they don't really encourage you to go out there. They have some crossover events, like they just did one with Yokai Watch, and that'll encourage you to go do it. And then it's usually limited systems. It's usually something like it's usually something like the current relic, which is their alternative to legendaries. Said you could go into like their zone of the Maw, right? It's called Boja, and it's very different, but like it's effectively the same concept. It's just it's opposite. In the Maw, you want to play with as few people as possible, and in Boja, you want to play with as many people as possible. And there's some odd mechanics happening there. And it's basically world bosses inside world bosses inside world bosses in an area full of people, and full of like elite mobs. So it's just chaos. It might be closer to Argus than it is to the Maw. I don't know. Whatever. And if you don't like it, in the past, if you didn't like the Maw and Torghast, they said in 14, they said, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, you don't have to get legendaries. Like technically the same eye level is reachable by doing this other content that's much harder. And so you basically can choose, do I want lots of playtime, or do I want to run the hardest content in the game? So I guess get good. Like, and it's just not, it just makes people go, but I wanted the legendary thing. I want it. I mean, it looks cool. It's purple. It like in my inventory, instead of being like green and blue, like it's fancy. It upgrades over the course of the expansion by doing more of that content as they unlock chapters to it. I like to collect them. There's achievements tied to it. I just don't like the content. Oh, well, this expansion, you can actually go run basically their version of world quests in a previous expansion, and it has a 100% drop rate of this item, and you have to get 20 of each item, and there's 6 zones. Each of the 6 zones has been split into pairs, and then each of those pairs drops one of the types of items. So you say zone A or zone B until you get 20 of that item, zone A or zone B until you get 20 of that item, zone A or zone B until you get 20 of that item. That's one relic, and then you can do that for each and every class. It took me about 2.5 hours. And that's it, and you're done. And you get your relic. And it breathed life into that, but then it died. Now I don't go back there anymore. So there are these moments where they'll release something like their limited job system, and it makes a spectacle. It makes an event out of going back to old zones and doing stuff. And you go there and there's people everywhere if you're doing it on patch day. If you're doing it months later, there's not. It's just you. Because we all came back there for a finite amount of content, and then it died. So both games spend all this time building beautiful worlds, building really neat content cycles, aiming to satisfy their current level capped players, and then afterwards it just dies. 14 encourages you to go back and engage with those when you're leveling your alternate jobs, and once you've leveled all the alternate jobs you want to level, maybe that's all of them, maybe it's not, you don't really have a reason to go back there. The game doesn't really take you back to old zones. I mean, currently we're in a place called the First, and we joke about, like, I guess I just live in the First now. And then, you know, it would take a patch event to drag us back into another zone, but then we would probably just be in that other zone. So, like, that's it. You kind of just live where the current content is. It'd be like living in Arbos, right? You don't really go back. You don't have a reason to go back. You have a bank alt. Why are you going back? So that's really it. And WoW can drag you back from Arbos by making sure that you don't have, you don't have a Bruto, so you don't have access to an auction house if there's not one up. You don't have an engineer. Like, okay, well then go back. But otherwise, like, you're not really spending any time outside the current zones. You just kind of live there now. And it fragments it. Now, WoW has breathed life back into games beyond just people chasing achievements and trying to fill their transmog. They have created, there's an add-on called All the Things, and this tells you what you have and have not collected from every zone in the game, not just in an achievement pane way, but in an actually trackable, interesting way that says, here's your percentage, and so you can go back and try to grow that percentage. There's actually a content creator on Twitch, Kuhn, that's all he does. He just chases all the things percentage, and so you can go there and check in. He's got a lot done, and so you can go there, and he knows about a ton of types of content in a legacy way, because that's what he does. He doesn't focus as heavily on current expansion, at least in the streams I've caught. He just kind of does his weeklies and his dailies from old expansions until they drop everything that they're supposed to drop, and then he moves to the next thing. It's a lot. It's a lot of stuff. And he's trying to collect everything that is collectible that was not removed from the game. If it's removed from the game, I think it's removed from his list. But he's trying to collect everything on every class. It's an enormous undertaking. There's also what's called Loot Appraiser Challenge. I think there's a second add-on that does it now. That's taken hold. But basically, there's an add-on that assigns the market board value on average across all of NA or all of EU to every item in the game. And it says, if you were to sell this, this is what it's been selling for over the last 30 days. This is its value. And we're going to call that a score. And then we're going to have a add-on called Loot Appraiser, track that score and tell you how much score per minute you're making. It's not the actual gold per minute you're making, because your individual server prices will vary. And because their world visit system isn't free to just jump server to server like 14's, you're kind of stuck within your market space for the most part. So you go around and you try to build up your score per minute. And the reason it's set to regional instead of set to personal is Loot Appraiser Challenges allow people across multiple servers to all agree to do certain content. We're all going to run this dungeon as many times as we can, which is up to 10 for 1 hour. And at the end of that hour, we're going to say the person with the highest score won. It's like a whole little game within a game that I'm sure most WoW players don't even know exists. It's just this whole other thing. And there are streams that do these, and it's fun. It is. And you go pick a class that runs fast so that you can be sure you get your 10 laps or as close to it as possible in. You know which mobs to skip, which mobs to kill. You get in the habit of trying, I mean, you want to personally kill. It's about mobs per minute is the goal. So, like, if there's time to complete 10 laps, then you want to kill literally everything. But some things like BRD, there's not. And you go back and you run old dungeons and you try to collect valuable stuff. And the beautiful thing about Alack is nobody loses. Everybody takes home the loot they found. So it's possible, due to server prices being in flux, that the guy in third makes way more money than whoever took first. Because I've been that guy. And it's possible that, I've taken first and then that item just isn't worth a lot on my server. And it's like, you made 450,000 gold in an hour. I'm like, whoa. And then I go check my server price, and it's like, you made a lot less than that. So you kind of stuck with what you're stuck with. Transmog is a weird market to get used to. And there's people that get into crafting in these games, and there's people that get into role play in both games, and there's people that get into speed leveling in both games. I was watching a speed leveler 14 the other day. They got their A Realm Reborn time down to 19 hours. The times for WoW are way lower. You can do like 10 to 50 in like sub 4. So, you know, go WoW, I guess, because that was their goal, was to compress it. So like that was one of the goals, and that is a huge success. The fact that the fastest people can get it down that says that a new player might actually be able to complete it without falling off, as opposed to most WoW players that hate 14. I have a feeling that they tried 14 and they put what they felt like was a lot of hours into it, because it was a lot of hours, and they didn't make it to cap because it's big. It's like, hey, why don't you go play? You know, you want to get to know the story because we're telling you it's amazing. It's going to be slow at the start. It'll pick up speed, but you're going to need to play about 200 to 300 hours of single-player content before you join us. There's going to be some group dungeons in there, and if you're playing a DPS, you're going to have a nice long wait for those, and you're going to have nothing you can do in the meantime. But, yeah, it's a great experience. And don't worry, I liked it when it was relevant, so you'll love it now that those zones are dead. Like, it's not a great new player experience. The fact that the game has good expansions doesn't make it compare to WoW making an effort. Whether or not you like the new player experience, I appreciate them making an effort. That's me derailing, but yeah. So this was really just meant to kind of start the conversation, and because you guys are having crazy conversations in the comments below, and I love it, especially when it remains moderately respectful, and I think that there's a ton of viewpoints you could come at this from. I just wanted to kind of mention that it's not that straightforward. Like, content doesn't just die, but it also very much does not live forever. Each piece of content either effectively dies for 99% of players, or it turns into something different than it was the first time. And there's a social community aspect that usually keeps it alive. Sometimes that's developer created, like Time Walking, or like Yokai Watch, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes that's something the community just made up, like the Eureka servers, or like Lax. There's just a community that just goes out and says, this content can be fun. This is the rules by which we're going to engage with it. Feel free to join us. And that's a very different thing, and I like that a lot. So when we're comparing current expansions and we're saying this content should not be relevant now because of what it will be later, I just wanted to kind of mention like what content will be later, because Torghast Tower will, in the form that it's in now, die. Deep dungeons do as well. There's a form of life that they take on, but it's very different than how we engage with them in current content. So yeah, that's it. It's just me talking about gaming. Kinda.